Hello and welcome back to Sean's Thoughts. Today we're at a pretty interesting space, an interesting forest scenario where, you know, it's called the UBC Malcolm Forestry Research Mountain area, wherever it is. And this is in beautiful British Columbia. And it's an area where they actually, you know, do several different maybe research projects, we'll call them, experimentations about forestry management and how we can perhaps even live with the forest once again. There's definitely industrial, you know, initiatives that are projected here, but yet there's also a kids school. It's a environmental school where it children have the ability to learn more about the natural world around them. And it's kind of like, you know, some sort of not social studies, but there was earth sciences. Yeah, it's more of a school for earth sciences where whether rain or shine, however the temperature is, the kids come out here as opposed to going to your traditional schools, and they're able to immerse themselves within nature while their classroom is the outdoors. And I actually wanted to send my son here, but we weren't able to get in, interestingly enough, when the applications went through. Although I was clicking on the portal to enter it 1 second after, by the time I had even clicked on the portal, it told me that all spots were already filled up. So I was forced to, you know, use my second alternative, which was Montessori style of learning for my son to do, believing that traditional school perhaps wasn't the way that, you know, I wanted for my son at that time. Anyways, I have visited this location several times and I've done a lot of different videos here, and I always truly appreciate the amount of education and harmoniousness with nature that this place brings to the world. And so here I am doing another podcast. It's only been maybe half an hour since I had my feet in the river. They're actually still very cold right now. It was quite cold out there. And yet I'm here now on a mountain a few kilometers away, sharing this beautiful redwood tree that is falling into decay. Yet you can see, even at the base of the tree that there is another root system growing. Actually, this is something that I've noticed, that perhaps that we had these ideas of what a dead tree would look like, and yet I've taken pictures often and I've showcased them in one of my videos where I showed trees growing from trees. Actually, I have this fly flying around in my head right now, around my head. There was this one trail that I was on where I had seen a tree which had been essentially cut down. It was a log, essentially, like the one that we're looking at in front of here right now. And it actually had a continuous tree growing out of it, meaning that the tree continued to grow regardless that it had been cut from its roots. And it was probably one of the first experiences that I had where I started to recognize that what we perceive nature to be perhaps sometimes limits us and limits our ability to appreciate what nature does bring to us. And even with the dead wood or the tree stumps that have been left there by the forestry people who, it was too much to take that one stump out and they clear cut the rest and they left that one piece there. A lot of times that one piece can continuing on its life. And actually, I'm looking up right now, and there is a continuation of life moving out this. So while the bottom of the tree looks like it's in decay, there's actually a full, or not a full, but there is a tree branch growing with life, with pines and all that lovely stuff. So, anyways, as I step into frame here, thank you so much for joining me. As I walked past the spot, I was thinking, oh, such a perfect place to sit here and do my podcast. Because, as you see from the thumbnail, perhaps, or maybe even the title, and interestingly enough, I was experiencing my calmness this morning when I got almost three different ideas come into my head at once. And they weren't full ideas, but they were possibilities, we'll say, of what I could talk about today. And so this is the second of 4 podcasts that I'm being encouraged to share with you. And the first one, the one I just recently did, if you haven't watched it, it's about when love reigns supreme over fear, or when love is, isn't it so nice? I got all these little pine needles coming down on me right now. It's absolutely lovely here. But anyways, yeah, so it's an amazing podcast that I did about love and about love reigning over fear and all that lovely stuff. And, I encourage you to go back and watch that. If you haven't, that's my first podcast today. This will be my second one. And this particular podcast I wanted to share with you. And interestingly enough, I was going to go somewhere else to do it. And then suddenly I turned left instead of right. Like that much. And the moment that I turned right, I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'm going to go there. And then even when I arrived here, which, as I said, is the Malcolm Research UBC forestry project thingy, I didn't realize what I was going to talk about when I got here. Because as I said, I had 4 ideas and I created 4 thumbnails for them, which, by the way, they are absolutely beautiful. And when I say I created them, I co-created them. I put the ideas in. I told the AI what I wanted to see and the titles and things. And so it helped me craft these beautiful, beautiful thumbnails. So I hope you're enjoying the thumbnails as well. I might just have a thumbnail party because some of these thumbnails are so amazing. And, I recognize the thumbnail is very important to catch people's attention, especially when we're living with so much distraction going on. But anyways, let's get back to what I wanted to talk about today, which was something called the Great Divide. And it may seem, scary, or, it might have a premonition of something that, might be challenging for people. But yet, this is an idea that I first came upon quite a while ago. I would say maybe even 2020, 2018, like sometime between that portion of time, a long time before even the events of 2020 began. And this idea was first introduced to me. I'm not really sure by who or where, but the one that actually brought it to the forefront of my mind was a person or a channeler named Bashar. And actually, the channeler isn't Bashar. The actual channeler, whose name is Daryl, and he channels a being or that is named or titled Bashar. And Bashar had talked about that we would come to a point in time, and he was talking about, the future to come, where society would move along 2 different timelines. And at that time, those 2 separate timelines would essentially appear to be within one timeline, meaning that there would be 2 realities that were almost coexisting at the same time. And that there would come a time eventually where those 2 timelines would start to move or to separate from each other a little bit further and a little bit further and a little bit further. And it would get to a point where it would almost be like a translucent piece of ice that would be in between the 2 timelines, meaning that you would be able to see from one timeline to another, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to perhaps impact or to affect the other timeline. Or more importantly, you wouldn't be able to be affected by the other timeline, meaning that someone on the lower timeline, or probably, as I show in the picture, the older timeline, going on the train route that a lot of people are choosing still to go on, yet there would be a diversion or a route off, and more people would actually be able to go on to that other timeline. And so if you look at the thumbnail of this video, and perhaps I'll find some sort of way to showcase it, it gives a really good idea of what I believe that's essentially happening right now. And why I say that is because my morning coffee this morning, I had the opportunity, I'll say, to sit beside a group of people who were talking about all of these, interesting things. And I say interesting in order not to project, but what I'll frankly share with you is one woman, she was actually talking about this other woman, and her children had been friends in the past. Means when the children were growing up, they were very close. And so the parents were friends. But when the children stopped being friends, this woman stopped being friends with that other woman. And she was actually recanting and telling a story and, in a sense, shaming the other woman. And I'm telling you this all for a reason, obviously. And maybe even the woman that was doing it may hear this one day. And she was telling a story about and mocking the woman, her son's friend's mother, for believing that they were still friends, that they had ever been friends, and kind of like jesting about, I can't believe this woman thought we were actually friends. We were only friends because of circumstances. And, anyways, she just kept going on and on. Now, I recognize that a lot of times we are led to do things perhaps that we need to, you know, make a change in our lives. So even sometimes by just voices coming out of our mouths, when we have a moment of self-reflection later, we're able to, self-reflect and look back on it. And maybe that's what triggers us into that change. But yet, living in this world where on one side of me, I have a man reading his newspaper and it's talking about all of these crazy things that are going on in our world, and other people on the other side mocking, good-hearted, well-intended people for making decisions about their own health, for example, and, jesting of, oh, I can't believe all these people believe they're doctors, as if, you know, what many of us, when we choose to, make different choices that perhaps the mainstream isn't making, that we ourselves are somehow punchlines in someone else's joke or in the coffee shop being talked about. And you know, I'm saying all of this because, just so you're aware, I understand that when we speak negatively about someone, which I'm not speaking negatively about this woman or her friends that were listening and joining in the conversation. It's an important distinguishment, at least for how I perceive my own actions, that there is a difference between, criticizing someone, even constructive criticism, and observation, being aware and being able to reflect that awareness or, talk about that awareness, discuss it, learn from it, grow from it as well. And so in a sense, that's what I was doing is I was bearing witness to parts of the old world that still existed around me, but yet they weren't of my reality anymore, meaning what they were saying, for example, I held no concern with. It was just an observation. It was, I see that's happening. And it was a great example of how I am and we are existing in two different realities. One reality where, people may give more credence or more power over to AI intelligence, for example. And yet others will, immerse themselves more in nature as I am, or the students that I can hear off in the distance giggling in their classroom outdoors, learning about the different kinds of trees. And, you know, it's interesting that I've come across the idea that certain trees, they live better around certain trees versus they might not, do as well when they're planted with other trees. So learning through experience and through even projects like this allow us to expand our idea of what, our participation within nature can and would and, potentially is going to be. And so this idea of a great divide isn't necessarily for me a fear-mongering device. Yes, it has been used to, separate people onto either the polarities of good and bad, as if, the good people are going to go one way and the bad people are going to go the other way. Rather than even how, as the AI interpreted my directions when I was doing my thumbnail, it basically shown or displayed that the great divide was more some people are moving towards their preferred reality where we immerse ourselves within, nature, where we can utilize technology in a far better way that we are aligned with, such as I am doing now. I'm sitting in a forest live streaming because I'm able to use technology, and there's satellites, there's cell towers, and the phone is a mini supercomputer. and even the wireless Bluetooth technology and the birds chirping in the trees, and overhead there's an airplane, a tin can flying in the sky. So we have a very great opportunity in that divide to move on a path where we can live in harmony while maintaining technology to a degree that doesn't take away from who we are. And yet, through that great divide, because we have been given our choice is our free will by our creator source, those other people may choose to move upon a path where reality is essentially augmented or continually to be augmented, perhaps to a lesser degree, maybe, as someone said, that maybe that they do move into a reality where, there is still hardships and there's still challenges, and maybe that it is a completely new timeline, just a recreated timeline of similar struggles and such. Not everyone perhaps is willing to get on the train when the train comes. Some people are still sitting there playing on their phones and scrolling. They're missing that opportunity, not recognizing that, sometimes we don't always get a second chance to get on the same train. And while there may be other trains coming up in the future, maybe this great divide that we are experiencing is allowing those who are ready to get on the train to reach for and shoot for the moon that they would choose to, you know, experience in this moment of now, is what's happening right now. And that was totally seen by, as I said, I'm sitting in this coffee shop and there's a great group of baristas. Some of them are amazing and they're happy and they're joyful. There was this one pretty barista that smiled at me and I smiled back. And, maybe I was immersing with my energy within that space just for her and for the others that were of that higher vibration. And then there were others who were challenged, dropping stuff. And there was the person on my right hand side and they were being critical of, their friend's mother, their son's friend's mother, who had these beliefs of, they had spent 10 years being friends because of their children, and she apparently mistakenly believed that they were still friends. And to my other side, there's newspapers about all the craziness that's happening in other parts of the world right now. And yet, across from me, there was a woman that was just dancing to Taylor Swift, having a good old time. And, it was easy to see that there were two separate realities that were coexisting. And you might say, oh, well, this has always been the way it is. But yet, for me, it has definitely been more pronounced. And especially as I find myself from my podcast that I share with you, finding myself moving forward in a direction of releasing all that was tethering me down before. Because this life that I'm choosing right now, that I'm, working towards, with creating multiple podcasts, with constantly evolving, with sitting in a forest wearing my Mario shirt. It's kind of chilly right now. Nonetheless, I'm still doing it because the trees are enjoying my voice. You're enjoying it. I'm growing as I'm speaking about it. And I'm here, showcasing this awesome potential for a world that I truly would love to exist in. And in my world of this great divide, I want to move into a world where I can be immersed within a school outdoors and everyone has the opportunity, not just a selected few who, they're the ones who first get it, or they were like what happened to me with Ticketmaster. Ticketmaster is a ticket agent thing. And I found that oftentimes I would want to go to a concert, but before I even got the opportunity to buy tickets, they would already be all sold pre-sale and they'd be available on a secondary site. Sometimes within the first couple minutes of going on sale, I'd be clicking to try to buy a ticket, and that ticket would already be all sold out for these major concerts. But yet on their sister site, is what they called it, all of those tickets would be back on available for double the price. And that's the experience that I experienced when I'm applying for my son to go to this school, is that the moment that the online registration became available, the spots were all gone. And I was told that I could be put on a waiting list. Well, 6 months later, I'm still on a waiting list with no direct communication about what's going on. Nonetheless, I would love to be and to move towards a reality where all children had the option, should they choose, to come to a school that is this amazing. And perhaps that's why I was directed here. And so, with this idea of a great divide that leads to a lower timeline into a higher timeline, perhaps it's just, the train has decided at this point in time to segue off to a space where new earth principles that, are composed of ideals of compassion, love, harmony, unity, global peace, where we no longer allow people to be hungry or homeless, that we respect one another and ourselves, and we're there for each other to a higher degree, and that includes me, myself, and I of course have had opportunities throughout my growings of 20s and 30s to do things in volunteers and things like that, but yet I was choosing to choose and do what I was done, led by what I was choosing. And yet now, as I come to this point of this potentially great divide, I see far better potential and possibility in the love and harmony of uniting and becoming a lot more than just the separation that we found ourselves mired in. And so this great divide, you know, there are lots of people who will choose perhaps to, keep themselves in a state of scrolling, continue to play those video games that stress one out, that keep us in a state of fight or flight. That's the experience that I personally had when I was playing all the video games. I was probably one of the greatest gamer scores for Microsoft Xbox because I just kept playing and playing, and I didn't realize that although my former wife was telling me, like, "You're all stressed out," and I was like, "No, this is my relaxation time." And then I was yelling and screaming at the console and the game, and my body was always tense. Actually, I still am working through an issue where my hand gets very tight as if I'm have my hand around a remote control, an Xbox controller. And so that's something that I'm a lot more aware of now, that I hold on to stress within my hands. And, those are experiences that, yes, I had to go through to get to where I was, because all of the experiences that we amass within our lives are, potentially lessons that we can utilize to make that higher choice. If you're looking at it a higher and lower, or make that more aligned choice with what we truly do want. And for me, I want love. I want the love of nature, the love of women, the love of children, the love of men, the love of community, the love of harmony. That's what I choose or desire to have immersed within me. So, regardless if this great divide is, a higher or lower, I would choose to rather see it as more aligned with nature versus more aligned with technology. And perhaps that is an older timeline. I've heard the story of the beings of Atlantis, for example, a former civilization, perhaps, that they chose to pass on realigning themselves with potential, with the ascension of their beings, their bodies, their mortal coils, or even just their overall connection or realignment back to source. And they had chosen what they had chosen. And perhaps that was more of a, I'm going to go after that ease, that Wall-E like Disney movie where everyone chose to, fill up Earth with garbage and then get on these big cruise ships and then end up being these overweight beings on floating wheelchairs because they were no longer, able to move themselves because they had just become such great consumers rather than, contributing back to the world that they had lived in, perhaps even, getting rid of all that garbage. If you haven't seen the movie Wall-E, it's an amazing movie because it depicts a potential reality that some could have chosen. And yet now we live in a world where we've got little pups called the Paw Patrol, one pup in particular, the green pup, his name is Rocky, and he loves to reuse and recycle. Phenomenal ideas, but yet what if we got to the point where we no longer even created plastic? We no longer created, materials that, well, they have their benefits, for example, of whatever they were, easy packaging or great insulation, that we created materials and we worked with materials that already existed within our environment. And we all lived in homes that were surrounded by trees. So we didn't have to, for example, have air conditioners. Just imagine that. Imagine we built our homes back to the way that we did in the 1950s. I've often talked about my grandmother's house, which has now been torn down, and it was designed in such a way that the house did not require air conditioning, that the way that the windows allowed air to flow in from all directions, and the basement door, the way that the basement door funneled the air up in from the carport, for example, it allowed the cool air from the carport to be sucked into the house and then sucked out of the windows, which all had windows that were aligned in a certain way, that the house didn't require air conditioning. See, we have technology or, wisdom of how we could live in harmony with nature. And so with this idea of great divide, it doesn't mean that we have to all like, throw away our cell phones and our iPads and our computers and go with Humpty Dumpty into the forest and, learn our lessons all over again. We can essentially take what we've learned and bring it into environments where we are, sitting in the middle of the forest with a cell phone and a Bluetooth microphone, as I am, enjoying a cold, cool summer's day without having to, you know, bring all those other things with us. And so, yeah, the great divide. I guess it's really all how people choose to perceive that. There will be a lot of channels and people talking about, everyone's going to go and they're going to experience this low vibration this way. And everyone's going to be, walking into heaven and throwing down and throwing away all their technology over here. But what if it doesn't have to be like that? What if we are more in charge? And what if I'm more in charge? See, I've recognized even by me coming out and sharing this, I don't truly worry now about how I'm going to be perceived. Honestly, just to let you know, if you haven't heard from previous podcasts, I truly appreciate the comments that come up in the videos when I create them live. And I appreciate them regardless if they're, high vibing or low vibing. Most of the times I might glance at them and say something if I have the opportunity, if the camera's close enough or something like that. But yet I've also seen the comments that try to distort and distract me. They try to, say things and, get upset if I'm not talking back to them. And, I apologize if you have left comments, but recognize that even if you leave the most glowing comment or the most low vibrational comment, however you've chosen to express yourself, there is a world of ripples out there. And your energy, however it is, your positive energy, your negative energy, if you want to get into polarity, it ripples out there and it sets, other actions into effect. And so even if, for example, and I apologize, in the last video, there was two beautiful comments, one from someone that I'm aware of and I've spoken to before. Thank you so much. And then there was another comment in there. And if you'll know who you are, because if you watch this one, I was just sitting in a river and I saw two beautiful comments. And then there was another one that, was pleased with my thoughts and I hadn't heard from that person before that I was aware of at least. And so I thank you for those two positive comments. I also thank you if, you're leaving comments that, don't align with what I'm doing, because as Eminem said, even if you're dissing me, it lets me know that I'm on your mind. So when I have that opportunity to go back and look at those comments, I totally, totally appreciate them. But yet we will all choose which way we're going. And it doesn't have to be the left or the right. It can be whatever path up the mountain we're taking. Paul Selig, in one of his books, often talks about we're all going up the same mountain and we're all going different paths. And sometimes those paths interconnect and we fall in resonance or we fall into alignment with one another and we meet sometimes for moments and sometimes for longer. That can be in relationships, whether they're intimate relationships or they're just platonic friendships or however it is we could see. And yet we're all, and I do believe all, I believe all of God's children are all on the path of the same mountain. And it doesn't really matter whether or not we're choosing to practice one of several thousand religions across this planet, or we're one of the hundreds of different languages that are spoken across the planet, one of the 7 skin colors that perhaps, maybe more, that are across the planet, whether we live on one side of a border or on another side of the border, we all essentially have an equal opportunity, I believe, to, we don't need to hold hands, but let's hold hands because, it might be a little, funner. But we all have the opportunity to course or to chart our own course in the direction and the side of, that great divide that we would choose. And I'm certain, beyond doubt, that even for those who choose to go towards the old systems at one point, sometime in their future, perhaps, if we still ascribe to time the same way, they will also themselves have that opportunity to make a course correction. And you never know, perhaps, just perhaps, that some of those people who we sit in the coffee shop right now and they're talking negatively about their friends or their former lovers, or they're even talking about other things in the newspaper. Maybe those people on their soul journey, they themselves and them, maybe they've already done the work and they were simply put there to perhaps trigger me to, spark my imagination about a future podcast that I could create. And it's being created right now in front of this beautiful tree. And maybe, just maybe, my perception of this tree is not what I'm being led to believe. Maybe it is a talking tree that's 10 billion years old. And this is just my perspective of that tree when it came into my reality. And maybe, just maybe, when we see a forest fire and it's burning out of control, maybe that's just our perception, but yet God has a plan for that land. Maybe it's being raised in the middle of nowhere so it can breathe new life of a new style of plant. And that our fear of, oh, it's too close, it's 3-4 kilometers away, we need to put it out and we need to spend resources and all that lovely stuff. Maybe there's a grander design. And, even with this idea of there being a great divide that's forthcoming, that I see, that I'm witnessing, that I experiencing now, right now, or at least that's how I'm being led to understand it. Maybe there's a grander plan. And maybe some of those people that are on their way to the maintaining the old systems, and as I said, they keep scrolling, maybe it's their divine plan to continue on. Maybe they still have some lessons to learn, or they have some lessons to help other people learn. You never know. One of the greatest things I think that I have, worked towards is my ability just to look at the outside world and observe without judgment. And sometimes, people might see what I say as judgment, but yet I feel that I'm truly aligned with, or at least I'm working towards the idea of being able to, assume that there's positive intentions, that people in their heart of all hearts, down at the core of who they are, each Homo sapien, regardless of they've been affected by an AI or, a demon or, an archon or whatever words we want to use, because everyone has perhaps different words for the same thing. Maybe regardless of all of that, we are all, doing our best to get up that mountain. And some people, they try to take shortcuts. Or other people, they might be walking up the mountain, pushing their boulder with really easy, turn around to get their Gatorade that I don't drink, and I highly recommend you don't drink as well because of the colors and stuff. But anyways, they turn around to get their drink and the boulder rolls back down and they have to then roll back down with the boulder and then push it back up again. That idea of playing whack-a-mole. There's lots of reasons why things happen, and perhaps removing that fear element and recognizing that things happen for a reason, trusting, believing, loving, And maybe you'll find yourself in your own forest doing your own podcast. Or maybe, you'll find yourself out there one day walking in the forest and a Sasquatch will come up and have a conversation with you because you will therefore be in alignment with that Sasquatch, that true being that, by the way, they live all around us in the forests. They are the caretakers of the forest. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's a couple around me right now, or maybe fairies or pixies or gnomes. Who knows, right? That's the important part is I leave myself open and available that even some of these trees might be awakening right now, awakening to the point that maybe they'll get up and start walking to live somewhere else. Who knows? Anyways, I thank you so much for sharing your time and attention with me in this beautiful place that is an inspiration. It truly is. And one day I would love to, sit amongst anywhere and everywhere with actual people and the forest life that's out of phase currently and share love and attention. So thank you so much for sharing your time with me. And I look forward to sharing more. Look for future podcasts coming today, perhaps. We'll see how I feel and what type of energy that I'm able to, you know, share with this forest. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for putting this time and investment into your own healing journey. Take what I say, hold on to that which resonates with you. Self reflect through comments is definitely a wonderful thing. And even if you don't feel comfortable about commenting in the comments on YouTube or wherever it is else that you find this video, comment in a book, have a journal, share your thoughts, reflect on what's been said, whether you agree or disagree. And you never know. Perhaps we'll be pushing the boulder up the mountain and we'll cross paths and maybe we'll let go of the boulders for a little bit and I don't know, do something. Anyways, thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.